This is Common Ground. I'm Sonja Wurz, and with me today is Dr. Adam Baird, who is an independent researcher. He specializes in the prevention of armed violence, gangs, and organized crime, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. We're here today to talk about chronic vulnerability and gang violence in Belize City. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you very much, Sonja, for having me on. Good to be here.
So today we're going to take a look at gang violence and responses in another episode. At the beginning, to get us started, when we look at Central America, probably when Central America and gangs come up in news headlines and in conversations about the region, we think of other groups, Latino gangs that originally emerged in Los Angeles and Central America. They're known as the Maras. Belize is slightly different in terms of the gangs and also the historical development it has had. Belize neighbors Guatemala. So because of its location, in a way, it looks to Central America, but it also looks to the Caribbean. Could you, initially, before we get into the situation in Belize and talk about the gangs, tell us a little bit about the research you've conducted about gang violence in Belize City? How is it that you came to do this research, and what did you do in Belize City?
Sorry, I think that's a great question. The first thing when I talk about Belize is people tend to look at me and go like, yeah, I've heard of Belize, but where is it? Isn't it like in South America, somewhere next to Guyana? And so it's kind of like a bit of a forgotten place, and it's flown under the radar of scholars, and it's really known as a holiday destination. So as you said, it's got a long border, the pretend border with Guatemala, and then it also flanks the Caribbean Sea on the eastern side. So it's a really interesting country in that it is part of SICA, which is the Central American Integration System. So it's kind of like the equivalent of the African Union, the European Union, the OAS. There's a part for Central America. So it's Central American, and they speak Spanish. But down the coast, most people speak English and another language, which is Garifuna. But essentially, it's kind of a bit Caribbean, and it's a bit Central America. So when we talk about gangs in the region, if you think Caribbean, people think Jamaica, Kingston, Montego Bay, the Shower Posse. In recent years, they think about Trinidad and Tobago. And as you said, when we talk about Central America, we use this term in the news, but also in academia, the Northern Triangle countries, which are sort of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which have been historically and notoriously very violent with the Mara gangs, which you mentioned. And so the other place, which we don't talk so much about, is Belize. So I wrote one article and I called it the fourth corner of the triangle, because we completely ignore it, right? And there is significant gang violence in Belize City, which is the largest city in the country. So people don't know much about it. People tend to go there on holiday and tend not to study it, and there's not much literature out there on the subject. So to come to the second part of your question about Belize, it's like, how did I end up going to Belize in the first place? Well, so people who are listening, they might recognize that I have a British accent. I'm from the UK. I was born in London, and Belize remains part of the Commonwealth, right? So if you look at the banknotes in Belize, they have the Queen's head on from 1973, which is really interesting. So people think about it, especially in North America, about going there on holidays, and the very famous, perfectly cylindrical blue hole, the Jacques Cousteau discovered diving spot, wonderful beaches. So it's an amazing tourist paradise, and I'd recommend that everyone goes to visit it. But I was working on gangs in Colombia in a city called Medellin, and I was doing some consultancy work with the UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program. And they said, Adam, you've done a lot of work on gang interventions, violence prevention. Can you come and help us out in Belize City? Because we've got a bit of a problem in Belize City. Obviously, like, my first reaction, like I suppose a lot of people who think about Belize, is like, this is a holiday destination. You know, what problems can there possibly be in Belize City? Now, that was back in 2011. So I jump on a flight from Colombia, go to Belize, and go and meet the UNDP and go and do a little tour of Belize City. And I'll leave this story here, but when I turned up in 2011 to help them design a gang intervention program, I was shocked to see the levels of violence which were comparable with the Northern Triangle countries I mentioned earlier. And I was also shocked that people hadn't really written about it, and it wasn't in the news and it wasn't in the academic literature. And myself as a gang researcher in Latin America and the Caribbean, I know most people who do research in this area, and there was nothing. And so after I left and designed a gang project, we might talk about that later in this episode or the following episode, I decided, I've got to go back. I've got to do some research, and we need to study what's going on and cast some light on this, mainly because the Belizeans were struggling to find effective responses to gang violence in the city. So Sonja, I'll leave it there, but that's kind of like the preamble about how I ended up being one of the very few international scholars who looks at Belize City and violence.
To get started on the situation in Belize a little bit. So you mentioned the general idea that people might have of Belize as a tourist destination. If there is gang violence, surely Belize has certain challenges that are at the root of this gang violence. So before we get to the contemporary situation in Belize as a sort of preamble, and this is, I'm aware this is a very broad question. We have limited time to look at the history of Belize. But could you tell us a little bit about perhaps some of the main elements of the history of Belize and how it shapes the current situation in the country?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, there's a 6-series lecture, to reply to this question, because it's that there's a lot to say, but I still think a snapshot of history is a really good explainer for why we get gang violence. Let me preface this by saying that across this region, we tend to get sustained gang violence in the most disaffected, disenfranchised, marginalized, impoverished, whatever word we want to use, in those types of communities, normally in urban areas, right? So where we get gang violence in Belize City, unsurprisingly, comes from, and very consistently comes from, the most disenfranchised part of the city. Now, that city is split by the Haluva Creek, and below the creek, where it's really a river, is the south side of the Belize City, which locals just call it Southside. That's where you have poverty, and that's where the violence and the gangs come from. So then, to get to your question, how do we get into that circumstance? What I did with the book and in previous publications, and part of my sort of orientation, my research, was to look back into history and so why do we have such an impoverished part of the city? What's going on? Now, there are many layers to the response to this, but historically, if we look at the responsibility of the British, myself as a Brit is something that I had to be very conscious of when I was in Belize. Colonialism, slavery, transatlantic slavery system, the disenfranchisement of the slaves, totally. These slaves were originally housed in barracks on the south side, right? So when the city was established, back in the 1600s and 1700s, the poorest part of the city was the slave encampment on south side. And I think what's really interesting is that part of the city still remains the poorest part of the city today, even though slavery ended it was sort of 1730s to 1830s, around about that period. And then it was a colony, British Honduras, in 1878. Then was called Belize in 1973, and then finally getting full independence in 1981. Throughout that period, the most impoverished part of the country pretty much has been Southside Belize City, right? And so when the Brits were in control, there was no investment and development of those populations. There were slaves. And following independence, what we've seen, to generalize, is a failure of post-independence, post-1981 governments to really deliver for those people. So when I've walked around those neighborhoods, there's often a lack of running water, Electricity is intermittent. There are no sewage systems. People live in one-room wooden huts, external toilets. There's widespread malnutrition. Education's low, no access to health, and along, etc. Right. So that's a snapshot just to say that this exclusion of this population has historical roots and has continued through into the present by continual failures to support and develop these neighborhoods. And then gangs develop amongst the most desperate, disenfranchised populations consistently. So I'll finish by saying it's no surprise that the failures of development of Southside Belize City has played a fundamental role in the way that gangs emerged there in the 1980s, something which we'll come to discuss in a moment.
What I saw in what you just explained is marginalization in certain areas. Also, of course, the presence of violence, urban violence. Perhaps something that we might add. I wonder also when we later talk about how institutions in Belize deliver and what the feasibility of gang interventions might be in Belize is corruption and how institutions function. So I wonder when we talk about Central America, to what extent Belize shares with its Central American neighbors trends in terms of corruption and a weak rule of law.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's key. Well, what we have in Belize is, okay, to add on to what you're saying, and I will answer your question, is very extreme inequality. If we look at the global Gini coefficient, which kind of measures the top 10% of income earners compared to the bottom 10% of income earners, Belize is in the top 10, like worst on the planet, right? So you have what is essentially a middle income country. Lots of tourism and people working in the tourism industry and other sectors who are doing quite well. And then you have, a forsaken part of the population living right at the other end of the socioeconomic strata in that community. So, I mean, that's part of the main problem in terms of, issues around corruption and development. I think these are kind of, post-colonial modernization, developmental problems that we have in a lot of places in the Caribbean and Central America. It's that independence came to Belize in 1981, and what we've seen is corruption through the democratic process. So lots of clientelism and patronage. Clientelism, for the listeners, the viewers, is in its crudest form is buying votes. And patronage is like, if you vote for me, then I'll do these favors for you. And if you don't vote for me, I'm going to block all opportunities for you that I can. And it's a way that democracy is undermined. And it's a way that the politicians effectively don't give back to the population. And it stops the population being able to hold the politicians to account. So, classic corruption, you lose money, etc., state contracts. But also you have a disenfranchised population which hasn't been able to press the state to demand that they put in sewage, better housing, electricity, better running water. That the fact that their children are literally starving in these communities in a middle-income country, right, where an hour's flight away on the Keys, people are sipping pina coladas. Southside Belize City, children are literally starving. So these are issues to do with development and progress and political accountability, which have been very weak in Belize. It's based in the colonial past, the Westminster system that they have in Belize, and the susceptibility of that system to clientelism, which undermines democracy, which has stopped the development of civil society, and it's stopped local Southsiders demanding that they're treated better by the government and state. And this allows a lot of space for corrupt activities to take place. So those in power can hoard money, hoard power, consolidate money, consolidate power, and it's not distributed effectively amongst the poorest in society who don't have their basic needs met. Hence, going back to what I said before, this really stretched out Gini coefficient, which underlies inequality in the country. apologies for painting a bit of a bleak picture, but these are the situations where gangs arise. So it's important to understand what I call the political economy of where gangs come from.
You mentioned the inequality in Belize. I would like to take a step back to look at crime and violence in Belize more broadly, even though we're going to focus on the violence of street gangs. But people might wonder to what extent there's also drug trafficking in Belize, and who is involved in the transshipment of various substances, especially cocaine. So could you remind us perhaps what are the characteristics of drug trafficking in Belize? Who is behind it? Is it the street gangs, as some listeners might assume, or are other actors involved in drug trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question, Sonja. What there tends to be an assumption, sort of in the literature, and to a certain extent by institutions such as the UNODC, which is the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, that when you get big flows of drugs through the region, and Belize, Central America is a transshipment region, and for the viewers, what that means is that the drugs are produced in South America, and they go through Central America on the way to other markets, which tends to be North America, but can also be Europe and across the Pacific into Australia, etc. So it's a transshipment area. And the narrative that we hear consistently is that transshipment brings violence. And so when I went to Belize, I expected to find street gangs where you get the vast majority of the homicide, the lethal violence occurs among street gangs. So I was expecting street gangs to be at the heart of drug transshipment, because this is what the literature was telling me. So I go onto the streets and I meet, a couple dozen gang members, and I quickly realized that they're not involved in international transshipment whatsoever. I mean, they would consider themselves extremely lucky if they, by chance, got hold of a bale of cocaine. I'm not saying you can't get cocaine on the streets of Belize City. You can, but the gangs, they smoke marijuana, they drink beer, and they're not big cocaine dealers, right? So this raises two questions. Where did the violence come from on the streets of Belize City if it's not because of drug transshipment? And two, who are the drug traffickers? Who are the drug transshippers in Belize? So maybe to go to the second part of this question, who are the drugs transshippers? I mean, through serendipity and multiple repeat visits to Belize, I've come into contact with what I would describe as drug trafficking families. These are very hermetic, which means they're very sealed off, very secretive organizations. They're kind of artisanal. They're quite small. They're not big conglomerate narco cartels that you would find in Mexico. They're almost like a family affair, right? Through kinship and friendship, and they're very closed off. And so they're essentially non-violent drug transshipping units, right? And so the ones I've spoken to there, members of these families, they go at lengths to not get involved with gangs on the streets in Belize City because they know that'll be violence and chaos. And they're happy making their money and transshipping using the least amount of violence possible and making the most amount of money. So you find these Belizean type of artisanal kinship family drug trafficking groups. And the other sector you find quite consistently involved is the police and the armed forces. That might sound polemical that I'm saying that, but across the whole region, the police and the armed forces have got a long history of being involved in drug trafficking. It's no secret. Belize is no different. The sort of narrative you hear from the Belizean state and government is, sort of bad apples. There's a few bad apples, and we need to root them out. And this does happen in Belize. They've sacked or fired a lot of police officers, but there's been a historical police involvement in the police and armed forces involvement in drug trafficking as well. And so to the next part of the question, right? So I'm saying this is the polemic. Drugs transshipment in Belize is non-violent, right? We can have that polemic out there and see what people say. And the violence comes from street gangs, right? So why do we have violence amongst the street gangs if they're not big drug traffickers? And that's a bit of a longer reply, and I think we're going to come to that in the second episode of this podcast. But I will say two key factors, which we can go into detail later. One is this whole thing we were saying at the beginning of this episode about the underlying social and economic conditions and desperation about these neighborhoods, right? So I conceptualize that as a type of vulnerability, right? So young people, young men in particular, and later we'll talk about gender, looking to make a name for themselves, and they join gangs. And historically, they've had base boys because they sell marijuana on the streets, which is now decriminalized in Belize. And then the key factor was there was a massive influx of weapons into Belize towards the end of the 1990s. One, because the newfound transnational gangs, which we'll talk about, the gang members were demanding weapons. And secondly, because of what are essentially bad neighbors, right? The pretend border I mentioned right at the beginning of this episode with Guatemala is jungle, right? And it's very difficult to control. And there are a lot of weapons in Guatemala because it's a post-conflict country. And also there are lots of weapons in Guatemala anyway. I'm speaking to you from Guatemala. And these flowed readily into Belize because there are so many Belizeans who have got family and friends in Guatemala in and around the area. And these weapons then flowed into Belize City in the end of the 1990s to these newfound gangs who were fighting over territory, marijuana sales, reputation. They call them beefs on the street. And that's why violence exploded. So it's not because of transnational cocaine shipment. It's other dynamics connected to vulnerability and weapons flows. And I'll leave it there because that was a bit of a long intervention. And Sonja, I'll hand back to you.
Let's move on to the gangs then. You conducted your research in an area of Belize City that's called Southside. Perhaps a first question before we take a closer look at Southside. You mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you were approached by people in Belize telling you there was a problem in Belize City. But when we think about gangs and Belize, do gangs exist only in Belize City or also in other parts of Belize?
The short answer is they only exist in Belize City. However, in recent years, because of the very high levels of violence in Belize City, a number of gang members have fled to other parts of the country, where they also, through kinship as well, they also have like family members in different towns and different places, such as Dangriga, Hopkins, Placencia, Key Corker, San Pedro, Orange Walk. These are all places which have received, for want of a better word, they're sort of fleeing gang members or gang members who've had enough of the gang life in Belize City. And there's also a little bit of a presence in Belmopan, which is actually the capital of the country, even though it's a small village with 10 to 15,000 people. There are also some gang members there. And I've got one of my key contacts for my research is someone who fled gang violence in Belize City and moved to Belmopan to set up shop in Belmopan, although he kind of left his gang life behind him. So the short answer is no, they're just in Belize City. I think the more nuanced answer is that there is a certain risk of gangs spreading out across the country. However, to date, as of 2025, I haven't seen evidence that gangs are setting up as institutions, if you like, in these other cities. It's still in Belize City.
Let's go to Southside then. We have already talked about marginality, about inequality in Belize. For people who are not familiar with Belize City, and I assume not many foreigners go to Southside, could you give us a sense of the place? What is it like in this area?
Yeah, I mean, Southside it's a fascinating place. And the first thing I want to say is, whilst we're talking about exclusion and poverty, etc., I mean, Southside is a marvelous people. I've met loads of them, hung out with them, ate barbecue with them, drunk beers with them. They're great, wonderful people, and there are loads of other amazing things that happen on Southside. However, it's a very challenging place. There's a downtown area near Swingbridge, which is kind of near the shore, which is almost affluent. The shoreline is actually quite affluent. But as you go back, it's quite a small territory. You can about 5 kilometers, you can actually start walking back through Southside. And the paved streets and the buildings give way to sort of dirt roads. And the structures are basically sort of one room. It's quite standard to have like a one room shack on stilts for hurricane season. with no great facilities inside. It's just one room, and so the toilet is just outside. They also have these sort of connecting plankways between some of the areas, so like Akalan, Martins, and these different neighborhoods, which are now quite notorious because of gang violence. They call them London bridges, and they're basically planks of wood thrown down over the land so you can walk between different areas and different houses. One of the issues is you have like this bake dry summer period where the dust kicks up and it's quite toxic because there's no effective waste disposal. So there's a lot of rubbish around. And then you have hurricane season, right? And in hurricane season, everything floods. And so you have like this rotting sort of stench as well in certain parts. And there's a Jamaican researcher called Dr. Herbert Gale who wrote about this in his book on it. And he's just like the stench, the toxicity, when you have a wet season of the garbage just fills your eyes and throats, right? And then you have intermittent lighting, no reliable electricity. As I mentioned a couple of times, you don't have proper sewage systems. You don't have paved roads. And there's just a little anecdote. I met the leader of the biggest gang in Belize City, and I went to have a chat to him. We've met a few times in the past. And when I went to see him the last time, he was outside of his house, which was a fair plot of land, but it was kind of like below the level of the road. And he was like digging himself, like manually, a trench around his house. And I'm like, what are you doing? He's like this big gang boss, right? And he was like, well, hurricane season's coming soon. I've got to try and protect my house and I don't want to get flooded. His house wasn't on stilts. And I looked at it like below the level of the road. Now that this guy's he's got no chance. His house is going to flood, And I'm like, well, where's the state, right? This is the point is like, where's the state? Where's the government, right? Because this guy is in contact with, or was in contact with, the government, with the local MP, the member of parliament, right? Which is the equivalent of a congressman in the States. And I was like, if you're the biggest gang leader in Belize, why are you digging your own trench? And why can't you pressure at least the government or the state to put in some infrastructure to take care of you, And I think what was really interesting is that showed the power dynamics between the gang members. They're not big narcos like El Chapo, like corrupting government and running government and state institutions that we see in other spaces in Central America and Mexico. They're kind of like lower level, not very wealthy, day-to-day type of gang members, right? So they're kind of ragtag, disorganized, and we'll talk about this in the second episode, types of gang members. So that's kind of the sense that you get from Southside Belize City, and this exacting, withering poverty. And I mentioned this thing about hunger, which I think is really key. And perhaps Sonja might want to ask me something else about this. It's just like the hunger, the anger, and the vulnerability of these populations, which pushes young men into gangs, and it pushes young women into other types of vulnerabilities like sex work, prostitution, however you might frame it. So these are all issues emerging, right, out of like this political economy of desperation. And I think that's something key to understand in these settings.
Right. So later on in this episode, we will look again at the issues behind the gangs to understand how it is that people end up joining a gang. When we look now at gangs in Belize City, gang landscapes tend to be diverse. There tend to be different groups that are in conflict. What kind of groups exist in Belize City, and how did they end up? How did they emerge in Belize City?
Yeah, this is okay. This is going to take us into the history of gang transnationalism in Belize. Okay, so as I've mentioned, we've got this socio-economic vulnerability of Southside. Okay, and then what you have in Belize, it's a sort of a highly migrant country. So not many people go to the UK, Great Britain, which is surprising considering it's Commonwealth. But the vast majority of the population, they migrate for a number of reasons northwards towards the USA. And so you have a large amount of the Belizean population overseas. There was Hurricane Hattie back in 1961, which basically laid waste to Belize City. And at its peak, there was an estimate by an author called Vernon, and he estimated that 40% of the entire population of Belize had left the country, and they were essentially pretty much all residing in the United States. When I looked at more recent stats, it's more like 20-25%, but you've got a huge amount of this population which moves to the USA. And then you've got like quite a vulnerable country socio and economically with not many opportunities. And then this is the classic trope of gang transnationalism, sort of, or what's also called sort of the gang deportation model. So, Belize is a lot of the migrants are the black and brown population, sort of African-American looking population. And I say that because when they moved to cities, predominantly in California, especially Los Angeles, the parents would tend to go and then they would bring their children with them after. And because they were disenfranchised, didn't have any money, they would tend to go to the poor parts of Los Angeles, which were affected by gangs. We've spoken about, Mexican and Mara gangs as well, which is the classic sort of literature of Mara transnational gangs. Sonja, yourself, you've written a book about that. But of course, the black and brown Belizeans, English speaking from the coast and Belize City, they migrated. When those that did join, a minority, those that did join, the young men migrated towards the Bloods and the Crips. And these are known as the colors gangs, which emerged in California, a number of years ago. So one of these characters, the guy I mentioned in Belmopan that I met before, he went to the States when he was 9 or 10, lived in a very poor neighborhood, which was dominated by a group of Bloods in the Roland Curtis area. He ended up joining the Rolling 20s, which was a Bloods clique, a Bloods set in Los Angeles, committed some crimes, was caught, and was deported back to Belize. That's just one story of a larger phenomenon where from the early 1980s, we saw these sort of deportation policies in the States. And so a number of Belizean men who got caught in gangs did some time in the States, or if not, they were sent straight back to Belize City. And so what you had with two phenomena. Belizean gang members from the Bloods and Crips were deported to Belize City. So they began to set up those identities in Belize City. And also what we call like a discursive appearance. So in the 1980s, Belizeans began to get their first television sets. And so it was like gangster rap, all these movies like Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society. And so there was a discursive framework behind this. And these young men being deported back to Belize City into disenfranchised areas like Southside. And so what I wrote an article called Man, a Killer Man for Nothing, right? And I spoke to a load of these gang members. And what I concluded in that was you have basically a disenfranchised set of young black and brown men in the States, like fighting back at the system, right? And then you have the same sort of demographic or body of people in Southside Belize City. And they also wanted to strike back at the system. So there's like this heroic identification with the tough gangster identity, the tough Blood and Crip, the NWA, gangster rap, fight the power type of character. And so they readily joined the Bloods and Crips as they set up in earnest in the mid-1980s, before the Maras, right? Earlier than the Maras, in the mid-1980s in Belize. And that was like the genesis point for gangs to begin in the 1980s in the city. The final thing I'll say on that, Sonja, is, because I want to keep these sections a little bit short, was that there was a type of gang in Belize already on Southside. They were called base boys. And a base is essentially a corner where they would sell marijuana or hang out, right? But they weren't very violent. They didn't really have weapons. They'd get into fights at the disco by Swing Bridge, and there'd be punch-ups. There'd rarely be deaths. And then when the Bloods and Crips came in, the gangster culture is also a very armed culture, right? And so that began to turn and twist and change the dynamics of what it meant to be a gang member in Belize City in the 1980s. And boom, the Bloods and Crips emerged and the city turned blue and red.
You mentioned the Bloods and the Crips. They are the main gangs in Belize City. When we look at the characteristics of gangs and gang members, we find that very often gang members are men. There are few women in gangs, and gang members tend to come from impoverished neighborhoods. Could you tell us about the gangs in Belize City to draw out some of the trends? Who is a gang member in Belize City in terms of age, of gender, of social class?
Yeah, It's effectively. I kind of use these three words. If they're poor young males, effectively, right? Those are the gang members. So, but I want to sort of nuance that as well. So they're poor young men from Southside, some from Northside, but not perfectly. They're not always poor, and they're not always young, and they're not always men. But the vast majority fall into that camp. So what this tells us is that gangs are attractive to young men who are socio and economically vulnerable, right? So why would they be attractive to this particular group of young people? And this is like, I've done a lot of work on masculinities and gender and gangs. And so when you have no decent legal opportunities, you may be semi-literate, you have problems at home, school is rubbish, you're never going to go to university. That's just like, that's never going to happen. And you're completely excluded by a floundering, government and state, which doesn't create any opportunities for you. It's just like, what the hell am I going to do? How am I going to get self-esteem? How am I going to get some status? How am I going to turn from a boy into a man with some credibility in my neighborhood if I have zero options, right? So if you think about it like that, and we try and empathize with where they come from, then all of a sudden they see maybe a set of the Bloods or the Crips, and they're going out, they're partying, they've got a bit of money because they sell marijuana, they've got girls, they're having a good time. People respect them because they're also a bit scared of them. So they're thinking, well, maybe this is the ticket. This is my best option, right? So what tends to happen is then young men, in search of respect, as Philippe Bourgois famously said in this book, they're looking for esteem. They're looking for identity, belonging, etc. So these groups become quite attractive for them. And they're kind of like male socialization spaces. It's kind of like men's work in a way that vulnerable young women aren't allowed into that space to take part in those gangs, to become gang leaders, to sell marijuana, to kill people. It's not their role. Now, let me sort of temper that statement by saying that even if the hardcore membership of gangs is made up of poor young men, it doesn't mean that they're somehow separate from the community or autonomous, or they don't interact on a day-to-day basis with the community. I mean, their sons, brothers, fathers, cousins, uncles, they're from that community. They're organic to that community. So they have day-to-day interactions with women, girlfriends, wives, their mothers, their girlfriends or ex-girlfriends who are mothers of their children. So there are complex dynamics within gangs. But if the gang brings in a little bit of money, women also interact with gangs because they're also vulnerable, right? So young men who are disenfranchised are vulnerable to joining gangs, and then they're likely to become disabled, get killed, end up in prison. But young women are also vulnerable in those particular socioeconomic circumstances. So they do engage with gangs. They might try and get a gang leader as a boyfriend to try and get a bit of money. If they've got kids, to get some money to help take care of their kids and that sort of thing. But then they tend to be subject to other types of violence. Or as in the academic literature, we like to talk about violences, right? So it may be sexual and gender-based violence, psychological violence, other types of violences, which they tend to be subject more to than the lethal violence that the young men are victimized by. So what I think is interesting, and I bring this out a little bit in the book, is that, if you're a poor young man, the chance of you getting murdered, becoming disabled, injured, or ending up in jail are astronomical, right? But if you're a poor young woman, the chance of you suffering a type of sexual or gender-based violence, if you engage with the gang, is extremely high. So this helps us understand a little bit about who joins gangs, why they join gangs, what male and female or masculine and feminine vulnerabilities are in those settings. And then that helps us think a little bit about how we can respond to supporting some of these communities.
Law enforcement often argues that gangs are associated with crime and violence. And of course, there is this link. But I wonder what else happens once people have joined a gang. And perhaps you could tease out a little bit the structures that exist within gangs, because we have gang leaders and we have other layers of gang membership. And also when we think back to the corruption that exists in Belize, and in the next episode we will talk more about the responses to gangs. But did you find there were differences between the leaders and other members and how they were able to take perhaps advantage of the gangs, or how they benefited economically for being a gang member.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, really interesting questions. I think maybe some basics. I mean, today there's anything between 1 and 2,000 gang members in Belize. The vast majority are Southside, although there are some Northside as well. And I think it doesn't sound like too many, because Belize is quite a small place in terms of population. The city has got about 60,000 people in it. We're not completely sure, but around about 60,000. So you got a couple of thousand gang members out of 60,000. Take it from me, that's a lot of gang members. They feel like they're omnipresent on the whole of Southside. And there's anything from sort of 20 to 30 different gangs in the city, and they're constantly fragmenting, which is something we'll talk about in the next episode. But it's like there's this constant fragmenting and expanding of many smaller gangs. So I think like the political economy of the gangs, the roles that different individuals play, gang leadership, gang membership. I think that's and the role of the police as well. I think that's really important. So I mean, historically, what we saw were what they would call in Belize generals. Now, a general was a word they took from Kingston, the gang culture in Kingston, and applied it to Belize about the gang leaders. So it used to be the Majestic Alley Crips and the George Street Bloods. It's kind of like two big franchises of the Crips and the Bloods, and they ran everything. And they had their gang leaders, right, the generals in their time. And in the early days, sort of let's say that from the mid 1980s to the late 1990s, these gang leaders would control everything. They would control violence. They would decide who could use a gun, who couldn't use a gun. And they actually sort of kept a lid on violence during that period. However, gang structures, they're not very democratic, and they're run by violence, right? So the gang leaders tend to be older men, right, who make all the money. And then the kids who are doing like the petty crimes, selling weed and drugs on the street and doing robberies and whatever, they're the ones who are basically only have enough money to get by on a day-to-day basis. So they're really poor gang members within that gang structure, which is kind of a vertical, unfair, for want of a better word, structure, right? And then what happened in the history of gangs in Belize is that a lot of these leaders were eventually killed, which precipitated or began the fragmentation of these gangs across Belize City. And it was like the rapid fragmentation of the gangs, which led to them, each new small gang wanting a new weapon, then bringing in more weapons from Guatemala. And that led to a massive spike in the homicide rate and the mess that we have in Southside today. Just, in terms of policing, I think we'll talk about police responses in a little bit more detail in the next episode. But I think we also have to have some sympathy with Belize. I mean, it's a brand new country. It's got limited human capital, limited resources, struggling to establish itself as effective democracy. I think Belize can only be described as semi-democratic. I don't think it's a full democracy because of the dysfunction of the institutions, right? So the police force is a state institution. I mentioned before that there have been historical links to drug trafficking. And there are issues with policing on the street. I've met loads of police officers, and I've met some brilliant police officers. I've worked with the police in Belize, and I've got a lot of time for a lot of the police. Some of them aren't so good, obviously, but I think they really struggle to police Southside. A lot of the problem is the low levels of education of the low-ranking police officers. Some in police have got PhDs, and some barely made it out of primary school, right? And they're semi-literate. And so what you tend to find in this sort of corrupt organization of the state and government structures is that policing always looks downwards, right? And this is something I write about in the book, and I know Sonja, you picked it up at the beginning of this episode. It's the partial rule of law. So what you tend to have is black and brown Creole Belizean police officers from poor backgrounds, a lot of them from Southside as well, policing poor black and brown disenfranchised young men who didn't join the police but ended up in gangs or petty crime, right? And so they're always looking down, right? And I've been into Belize Central Prison numerous times, and I'll sort of leave you with this anecdote, right? But I spoke to the director of the prison, and I was like, how many corruption's rife? Like, how many politicians have you had in jail? And he was like, we've never, ever had one. And then I went around the prison speaking to gang members and individuals in the prison, and they're all poor black and brown men, right? And so like white collar crime, you can do what you like. That's what the rule of law is telling you, right? But if you're a poor black and brown man and you use any type of violence, we'll send other poor black and brown men to come and get you and put you into a prison which only hosts poor black and brown men, right? So there are all these race and class dynamics about the way the rule of law is exerted in police, which is why I call it the partial rule of law. And go and buy the book, and you can read more about it. But that's like a snapshot of what I'm talking about.
In this final part of this first episode, I wanted to turn to what might be called the exit from gangs. So you explained why young men might be drawn to gangs. Often this is in search of status, of respect. But once they're in the gang, they're also exposed to violence. And it seems that often there comes a time when gang members themselves get tired of the violence and would like to step away from the violence or to step away from drugs. In Belize City, when in your research, when do people reach this moment of wanting to step away from the gang?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and I think it's one that gang researchers in the Americas and the Caribbean have been wrestling with for quite a while. I mean, I don't think there are any really clear-cut answers, although we do have some indications about what happens. One is called like aging out. So, you join a gang when you're, in Belize City, I'd say between the ages of 12 and 15, you join a gang, right? So if we all think about when we were 12 and 15, what our outlook on life was, what we wanted to do, we wanted to go and have fun. We didn't think about the future. And then aging out in a gang is, you get a bit older, you've been doing it for 10 years, you might be getting a bit tired. All of a sudden, the violence that was exciting is now a bit scary because they've killed half your friends, right? Or your brother's been killed and you're like, and then it becomes traumatic. Or you got a shot wound in the shoulder and you can't feel your hand anymore, right? So you've got these traumas and these build up, and then maybe you have a couple of kids. And then you're just like, you know what? I'm getting old for this. And all the kids who are coming into the gang are 15 and I'm now 28, 29, 30, and it's not paying me. And, I've got a bad leg and I've got a bad shoulder and I've got 2 kids, and I'm tired of getting up in the morning and going outside and wondering if someone's going to shoot me for, the past crimes I've committed. As they say, the past never forgets, right? And especially in those settings. And Belize City is like a village. I mean, something I didn't say before. It's like a village. Everybody knows everybody. Everyone seems to be linked by kinship or friendship or something, right? And so it gets tiring. And there was a guy I spoke to who's, alias Shorty, and I recently written an article, which is going to be a book chapter coming out in Bloomsbury Press next year, about his life history. And here was the guy I mentioned who moved to Belmopan, which is the administrative capital in the center of the country, not Belize City. His motivations were along those lines. It was like getting old, getting injured. He'd been in jail 3 times. He didn't want to go back. He spent half his life in prison. He was like, I don't want to go back. He had kids to take care of. He loved his kids, genuinely loved his kids and wanted to provide for them. So he left the gang because he was like, sooner or later, someone's going to kill me. And if they're not trying to kill me, I'll just be hanging out with the guys on the street corner, and someone's going to come by and spray us with automatic fire, and I'm going to get hit. That's it. I'm out. And he's in his early 40s now. So he moved to Belmopan, and he said to me, Adam, the only thing I've ever done my whole life, because he was deported from the States, was just selling dope. And so in Belize, it's interesting. There's not a lot of what we call in England Class A, or what they say dope in the States, like heavy drugs. It's mainly marijuana, and it's now been decriminalized. So what he's done is he's moved from like this hardcore gangbanger in the Bloods to basically using his house in Belmopan as like a community center where he sells weed. Now, the sale of weed is still illegal in Belize, which is kind of like this contradiction, this sort of catch-22, but the possession of up to 10 grams, I think, is legal. So as long as you're smoking at home and you can carry 10 grams around, that's fine, but you can't sell it. So he's still breaking the law, but I spent a whole afternoon with him. We sat down, had chicken and peas and rice, drank a couple of beers. He was smoking some weed. The customers came in. And so he transformed from like a hardcore gangbanger into like a community weed seller. So there are pathways out. And that was quite anecdotal, but let me just say something which is important about the context of Belize, is that Belizeans have been conducting gang negotiations for longer than anyone else on the planet, as far as I know, right? These go back to the early 1990s, official gang negotiations with government and state institutions. And I've met a number of gang members who have got out of gangs. And so I think it's important to say that it's difficult to get kids out of gangs, to demobilize them, especially if they got trauma, addiction issues, etc. But it is possible. And when we talk about violence prevention, and I designed a gang intervention project in Belize, which we'll probably talk about later, right? But if you give these young men opportunities, back to school programs, training, you feed them, right? And then you give them attractive opportunities to get out there and make some money legitimately, then we found in our experience that the majority of them will take those opportunities. So then the question becomes, and maybe for the next episode, is like, well, where are these opportunities, right? Why aren't they there? How can we create them? Because that's the only way you'll get rid of this vulnerability I spoke about previously. And that's the only way you can sustainably get rid of gangs, because if you ask the police, they'll just go, let's put them all in jail, right? If you're a hammer, as we say in English, everything looks like a nail, but you're just dealing with the symptoms of the problem. You're not dealing with the underlying causes, right? So the more advanced thinking is that we must deal with the chronic social and economic vulnerability in those communities for the benefit of not just young men who join gangs, but the whole community, women, children, everybody else. If we can address that, and Belize is quite a rich, relatively middle-income country, if we could address that, then we could resolve violence on Southside Belize sustainably.
Adam, thank you for this final reflection, which is going to tie us over into episode 2. This is the first of 2 episodes to talk about chronic vulnerability and gang violence in Belize City with Dr. Adam Baird. Thank you again, Adam. And I'll see you again for episode 2, when we're going to talk about responses to gang violence. This was Common Ground. I'm Sonja Wolf. Until next time.